Our scripture today comes from the book of Mark, chapter 2, verse 23 through chapter 3, verse 6. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his word. I'm going to ask you guys a question. Think about a fairy tale we all read when we were little. Have you ever felt like you're the white rabbit in Alice in Wonderland? You know, and he went running around saying, I'm late for a very important date. No time to stay and talk. I'm late.
Yes.
Well, I think we all feel like that sometimes. We don't have any time to stay and visit with someone. We have too many things to do. You know, we plan every moment of our time. We have work. We have errands. We have appointments. And I mean, even those of us who are retired fill our time too much. I know my dad said to me one time a few years after he retired, he said, "I'm so busy all the time, I don't know how I ever found time to go to work." And I know some of you can sympathize with that. In the summer, I get several weeks out of school. But I get 8 weeks, but I always plan at least 16 weeks worth of activities, more than I could get done if I had twice as much time. And we're always adding more. Some of it's work, some of it's fun, but all of it keeps us overcommitted. You know, even our children are overcommitted. And how much of what we do is ferrying our children around, or grandchildren, from one thing to another, from sports to classes to lessons. We're just too busy. And God has a plan for that. This story shows Jesus on the Sabbath. Now, it seems like Jesus is breaking a commandment and doing what is unlawful, because we are told to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. But by the time of Christ, there had been so much added to the commandments. They had added prohibitions, and then they'd added rules to help carry out the prohibitions. There were 39 letters in the original Hebrew language of that commandment. So, at some point, the Pharisees and Hebrew leaders had multiplied 39 by 39, and they came up with 1,521 ways to break the Sabbath. The commandment says, "You shall do no regular work." Reaping and threshing is work. Plucking the kernels of the grain was equal to reaping, and rubbing them together between their hands was equal to threshing. So, according to them, the disciples were breaking the rules of the Sabbath. Now, I want us to notice here that Jesus did not have a problem with the Sabbath. He mentions that the Sabbath was made for man. He only had a problem with the extreme rules and regulations that had been applied to the Sabbath. So the Pharisees say, "What are your disciples are breaking the Sabbath?" And he meets their objections. He says, "Well, what about David?" Which David was a character at that time. He had been their first most powerful king, their second king, but the first really powerful one. And he was respected by all the Jews. He was the greatest king they'd ever had. And so using him as an example meant something in the Jewish culture. And David had met the needs of his followers, even though it meant breaking temple rules. Well, Jesus' followers, his disciples, were meeting their needs. And Jesus was greater even than David. He was the Lord of the Sabbath, and he had the right to interpret its meaning. And then we go to another incident. We have a man who needs healing. And the Pharisees watch to see what Jesus is going to do. And Jesus asks, "Is it ever the wrong time to do good?" And they just remained silent. They didn't want to make people angry. They didn't want to give permission. But Jesus was angry with them for their attitude, and he went ahead and he healed the man. And it says the Pharisees went to plot his death. So apparently plotting murder on the Sabbath wasn't work, and it didn't break any of the 1,521 rules that they had invented. But the fourth commandment is very, very simple. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Now, Christians aren't obligated to follow the Jewish Sabbath rules. That commandment is actually not repeated in the New Testament. And Colossians 2:16 tells us, "Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day." And in fact, most Christians don't observe the traditional Sabbath. The early church began meeting on the first day of the week because that was the day of resurrection, and the majority of Christian denominations still do that. But it's not commanded. It doesn't tell us when we should worship, only that we should worship. But the other part of that, we're not commanded that we have to do it. But Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man. You know, the first mention of a day of rest is in the creation story. On the seventh day, God rested. Was he tired? No. It was an example for us is a healthy rhythm of work and rest. You know, this Sabbath principle is that we need to take time to stop work, rest, and worship. Most of the time, I preach about how we treat other people. I preach about our relationship with God. Today, I'm going to talk more about how we treat ourselves. Do we give ourselves time in our busy, busy schedule to relax, to rest? We need a time to take notice of God and his place in our lives. You know, you can rest and worship on Saturday or Sunday. You know, some people are on a non-traditional schedule and their day off might be Tuesday. I have a really good friend who's a pastor, and she's a pastor of a big church, and they have 3 services, Sunday school and youth group on Sunday. So Sunday is not her Sabbath. She takes off on Tuesday, doesn't do any appointments or anything, and uses Tuesday as a Sabbath. You know, we can use any day to accomplish the purpose of rest and worship on the Sabbath. I read a story that David Dykes recorded. And he was talking about, there was a safari, and the people on the safari, of course, had paid money for it, and they wanted to keep going and going and going. And they went 10 days without a break. And on the 10th day, the people who were leading the safari, the people from the native culture there, said, "We're going to rest today." And they said, "No, we want to keep going." And the reply was, "We rest today. We must allow our souls to catch up with our bodies." And I love that description of the Sabbath. Sometimes we need to slow down and rest so our souls can catch up with our bodies. We rush. And we don't take the time we need for ourselves. We associate church attendance with the Sabbath. And church attendance is not really commanded of us. Church is a place to come to learn about God, to learn about His will for us. It's a place to have fellowship with each other, and it should be something we look forward to. But it's not an obligation. It's not a requirement for salvation. Paul does tell us not to forsake gathering together, and there's a reason for that. There's another story I read about this, and it was back in the days when people heated with fireplaces. And there was a man who had not been to church for a while. And the pastor came in to call on him and said, "We've been missing you." And he said, "Well, I can worship from where I am," which is perfectly true. We can. But the pastor went and sat in front of the fire, and he took the tongs and he pulled a burning ember out of the fire, and he put it on the slate in front. And that burning ember immediately started to grow cold, and it turned ashy. And it got colder, and then the pastor picked it up with the tongs again and put it back into the fire, and it burned brighter. So we need to worship and to gather together because we keep each other burning brighter. But I'm also going to say that one of our members here told me that he really felt closest to God when he was on his own out in the woods. And that's okay too. We need to take time. We don't want to place unnecessary importance on the outward aspects of our religion. We need to know the purpose and the meaning of what we do. So nobody should attend church because we're supposed to. We should do it because we understand the importance of it and we want to. You know, the Pharisees judged Jesus and his disciples because they didn't follow their rules. And we need to be careful that we don't do the same thing. We shouldn't invite people to our church if the reason that we're inviting them is that they should be going to church. We should invite them to our church because we want them to share a blessing. You know, if we see a movie or read a book or watch a TV program and we enjoy it, we're going to tell other people about it. We're going to say, "Man, you really need to read the new book by so-and-so," or "I just saw this movie and I loved it, go see it." And that's why we should invite people to church. It should be a joy. We say, "You should come to our church because we gather every week and we celebrate Christ's sacrifice on the cross. We celebrate our salvation and we have fellowship together." When we're talking about the Sabbath, we need to not make up rules. You know, working in the garden is a joy to me. And there's no commandment that says, "Thou shalt not enjoy life on the Sabbath." Instead, it's a time to rest and worship and allow ourselves to enjoy life to its fullest. For me, that might be out in the garden pulling weeds. I love that. For somebody else, it might be taking a walk in the woods. For somebody else, it might be just sitting alone in a quiet corner of their house and meditating. But the Sabbath is about taking time to rest and worship and allow ourselves to enjoy life to its fullest. Jesus said, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest." So for your family's sake, for your sake, for your soul's sake, and for God's sake, get some rest. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.